Hey guys, this is Infinite Flash here. Today I'm going to be working on some tactics trainer videos. And who knows what's going to happen today. In today's session, I'm going to be working on beginner leveled tactics in this session. I want to explain my thought process and the best way of going about, approaching winning material, winning, let's say, a checkmate in some sense, in some cases, how to approach positions like that. So just tactics in general, like what's the decisive way of approaching things. Let's see what happens in this first position that we're after. Well, here in this position, I think what we have to notice is that Black's king is very weak in this position. Sure, the bishop is free, but the problem is that after rook d3, I think that Black has queen e7 to guard against some of these threats. So let's pretend rook takes d3. So if we take the bishop, then this black queen comes over here maybe, or maybe even queen f7. Maybe queen f7 is a better move, or maybe not queen f7. Well, rook takes d3. I wonder, is there a better move? Oh, maybe rook h6. Maybe rook h6. Maybe not. I'm not really sure. Rook takes d3 looks quite acceptable, but white clearly has a great continuation here. So we have to pay attention to this black king right over here. Notice that the g7 square is taken by this pawn, and this queen is taking the rest of these squares along the e7 and e8, g8, f7 squares, right? So a piece could, let's say, attack this king, then we're in good shape. It would be checkmate, actually. Let's say if there's a bishop on d6. Let's just pretend then the queen wasn't here on the c7 square. Let's say it was on, I don't know, a6. Bishop on d6 would be checkmate, but we don't have the bishop. We need to find another piece that does it. And what we have to notice is this theme with this knight coming in and delivering checkmate on the g6 square. So one thing that it kind of helps is when we go back and look at this, is that also by going this g6 square, we just have to notice the squares that are covering all of the king over here. So, and also, knight d7 in a real game would be a plausible continuation. But I'm sure that, mate in one is good. Knight d7, queen takes d7, queen takes d7, bishop e4 is not very clear, actually. Black has quite a bit of pawns over here on this pawn chain right over here. That's very troublesome for white. So he has to be very careful about what he takes in this position. So knight g6 is the right way of approaching things. Let's see what happens in this next position. Let's see, we have king g1. Interesting. Well, we have to go through what are our possible captures in this kind of position. Let's see our candidate moves. Let's see, we have queen takes f4, that's capturing the rook. We also have, moving this bishop away in some way and delivering checkmate in this position somehow. So we can either give a check, try to get him in a mating pattern over here. This black king looks very weak to me, or we can take the rook. Those are the main two options I see. Slow moves like queen h3 followed by queen h1 or something like that just don't work in my opinion. You need to be very forceful in this kind of position, given that you are down, let's say, the a1 rook in this position or f4 rook, since you're down material. And white has a very nice material advantage, but his king is weak. And so what we have to do is go through these. Let's see, queen takes f4, king takes g2. Maybe king h7, followed by rook g8. Looks plausible. It does look very reasonable to play that. Well, I'm not really sure if white really has a defense there, given that rook g8 and the queen infiltrating is extremely, somewhat dangerous, actually. Looks pretty good for black, actually. But I see another continuation. That's the more keyful one, and that's bishop h3. The idea is that after bishop h3 check, this rook doesn't necessarily have to be captured at the moment. You can insert this check without having to worry about capturing the rook. This rook can't come back and assist in the defense. And now we see that white's king is extremely weak. So we can take the rook and have quite a decent position, or we can forcefully just win the game on the spot with queen g2 checkmate. And what we have to see is that in this theme, by moving the bishop away, we are uncovering this attack on the king, and this king has to move in a forceful way. These are forcing moves that you want to keep in your mind. These are moves that have to come first. The rook can wait just for a little bit, so if you can delay stuff like that to improve your position, that's advisable. Okay, c4. Interesting. Yeah, of course, there's a lot of stuff going on, but you can give checks along the second rank, and you can even take the pawn on c4. But you know what? I guess white didn't want the. You can't really take the pawn on c4 because of rook b7, and this perpetual might happen. I think. Actually, it might be even a mate if you're not careful. So what you have to do is counterattack. Rook d2 does give you a draw, but the thing is, I don't think it gives you any more than that. Rook g2, king e1, right? Then it's not so clear what you're doing in this position. I don't see a good check after that. Rook f e2, king f1, and you're actually out of checks, and I think white wins that position. You have to check along this way, and in fact that's checkmate. But the idea is that this is the most important check since white's king is trapped behind the second rank here, since it's being cut off by this rook. You have to realize that by moving this rook away, you still have this rook covering the second rank, and the king is not escaping, and the spaces along the f1 square for the rook are just taking away everything for white. So let's move on. Let's see. Ooh, it looks like a French defense kind of position. It's a French defense pawn structure for sure. Let's see, rook c1, interesting. So the first move that pops into my mind is, well, not first move. The first idea is that I see that there's this pin on the c1 rook. White is in very ugly shape, and one idea that we can try to do is queen c7, trying to apply some pressure along this position. That's certainly good for white. Good for black. I think after queen c7, the only problem with this move, I'm just trying to figure out what's the real problem with queen c7. There's nothing wrong with queen c7. It's just, I guess there's just a stronger move since it immediately does good work here. And that move, I think, is trying to break the pin along this diagonal. Notice that if the bishop is removed, we can capture the rook in this position. So one idea is trying to, remove the defender of this, let's say, this file that will allow us to infiltrate and capture the rook on the c1 square. So let's see if we can find a way to try to do that. One way is actually just moving the pawn up to the d3 square. Notice that if this bishop actually just moves anywhere it goes, we are capturing the rook on c1, and then we have a decisive material advantage. Let's say if we play pawn d3, and okay, bishop takes d3, then we just take the rook on c1. White is unable to capture with the queen or rook. d3, queen takes d3, we can capture the queen, and then we are up a huge amount of material there. And d3, white doesn't have a single move in the position that will save them, I think. So I think that d3 is doing good work here. I'm just wondering what is wrong with queen c7 actually. That's more of a specific question that I have in mind here. Let's see, if we open up an analysis board, what do we get here? Let's see, rook c1, d3. Apparently queen c7 doesn't even appear. Interesting. Oh, I think I know why, because if queen takes d4, perhaps? And now that the rook takes c2 is not possible because rook b takes c2, and the queen is the only thing that's defending the rook. Ah, okay. I don't know what's going on in this analysis. I just figured that one out. Sorry about that, guys. But that's the idea of this tactic. You want to remove the defender. Very important thing to remember in a chess game. That will win you quite a number of games in your career if you play a lot. One thing that pops into my mind about this position is that the queen and knight are just spectacularly great pieces here. And one thing you need to note is that the c3 square, e3 square, d2 square, all these dark squares are tremendously weak. So what we have to do is start looking at the checks in this position. Let's see. Knight c3 and queen e3 are my main options in this position if I'm forcefully going for the win. I think it's pretty obvious that black is playing for checkmate in this position. The queen is offside. The bishop is not a good defender of these dark squares, and the rook is a bit out of play in this position. It's not relevant towards what's happening in this position. Let's see. Knight c3. I think the problem with this move is that, white is not retreating with king d1 or king c2 in this position. After knight c3, he is playing king f3, and I don't see an obvious continuation of how to get at the white king. Knight c3, king f3, queen d5 check is possible, but I think after probably king g3, it's not so clear how you can possibly check at the white king here. What you want to do is think about how to check this white king and get it into danger. So our next continuation that we have to look at is queen e3, and I think this is the right move, I think, in this specific situation. One thing you want to keep in mind after queen e3 is that you see that white only has one move after queen e3. This king can't go to the f2 square, can't go to the d2 square, it cannot go to the e1 square. The f1 square is taken by the queen, and then we have queen e3, forcing king d1. And what you have to visualize in this position is that the king on d1, again, is kind of immobilized by the pawn on the c2 square, and the bishop is not really protecting any of the key squares. The queen is on e3, so it controls these two dark squares right here on the d2 and c1 squares, and on the e1 squares. The queen controls also the e2 square that we need to monitor. The king has only got the d1 square, and after that, we can finally play our desired knight c3 checkmate that we saw in the other game. This kind of configuration with the queen and the knight appearing on these two squares is very, very bad for white, I think. It's very troublesome to play this position. The queen and knight are just too strong of pieces to not be held down like that. Alright guys, let's see what happens for the next game. Alright. Knight d7, interesting. Yeah, I mean, right now we can see that our queen is under attack here. And, well, it's forking our king and queen. And the thing about material, and rook, by the way, this is a royal fork, we definitely do want to keep the queen on the board in this position. So, since the queen is more valuable, the most valuable piece, you probably want to give up material that is less valuable than that. There are special cases where the queen is less valuable than certain pieces, but in this case, the queen is definitely more valuable than the rook. So you've got to give up this rook, and after rook takes d7, it turns out, what, white doesn't really have a certain amount. Not a great attack, I think. I think after rook takes d7, you can probably retreat the bishop to. I'm just trying to figure out a good move here. I want to prevent bishop e5 check. That looks somewhat dangerous for me. So maybe rook f5. Rook f5 looks very plausible. I think I like that one. Rook f5 looks okay. And I think black should win easily too, that position. But the idea is that you're giving up less material for to avoid big material loss there. So that's good. It's a good idea to keep in mind for you guys. Let's see. We have an interesting pawn structure here. And one thing we have to keep in mind is if the king, okay, just a random point. If white's king was on c4, I think white would win this position pretty easily. But this king is interestingly placed here. Black can give a lot of checks here. I guess the first checks that you have to really look at are, rook f7, rook f4, rook g5 here. These are all very plausible continuations. But the important theme to notice in this position is that the white king is somewhat isolated because of this e5 pawn. Notice that the e5 pawn is taking away this square from the white king. And this rook is also taking away the f4, g4, g5, g6. These rooks are taking away those squares, and most importantly, the e4 retreating square. So, the white king is taken by basically every square but the f6 square. And interestingly enough, since there's this theme of, the white king only has one square, we can try to think of how to round up this king, how to check it a lot and force it into, let's say, a mating pattern. And the first idea that comes to mind is how do we keep the king from retreating back here, and we can maintain our strong attack here. So we want to keep our rook here and somehow give a check. Rook f7 is not good because king takes g4 happens, and we drop a rook. Rook g5 with this rook allows his king to escape backwards here, and we can't allow that. So what we have to see is that this rook comes to this square, and then the king is forced to run down to this square, to the f6 square. So after rook g5, king f6 is forced, and now we see the beautiful idea is that this rook also covers these squares on the g6, the g7, and the g8 squares. The pawn is still on e5. The king is covering all the important squares here on the e6, e7, and e8 squares, and we can deliver the final blow with rook f4, checkmate. Very, very nice mate in the endgame. Very surprisingly, that would be unfortunate to come across if you're the white player. All right, guys, that's a very, I think, instructive kind of idea. All right, let's see. What's the next problem? Interesting. Knight e5. Still not used to this kind of problem. Interesting. I'm not sure at the moment what's the best way of proceeding. This is slightly interesting, and I think I spotted the main idea of what I'm supposed to do. In this position, we definitely do have to look at checks and captures first. One of the first ideas you might think is, how do I get my queen to check this black king on the g8 square? Queen c4 is something that you might be interested in, but knight takes c4 happens and you lose the game. The same thing goes for queen b3 check. The next thing you might look at is, how do I capture this knight? How does help, because my knight is under attack, I need to defend the piece. So the first idea is that you might think of knight takes e5. And after black recaptures e5, what's my move then? If we look at the forcing sequence of knight takes e5, we see that black cannot play bishop takes e5 because of queen takes e5. And, white is going to be winning material there. Black is hanging the knight, which he cannot afford to do. So after knight takes e5, I think black would play rook takes e5 and have a fine position, except for the fact that white has the very nice move d4. I think that's really just killing black immediately. So the idea is that with knight takes e5, rook takes e5, d4 is forking the rook and the knight. There's no way that black can save both pieces, and I think black should be definitely struggling in this position, actually, after knight takes e5. And let's just say, I wonder if we can insert queen here, though. Probably not. Probably just d4. The only thing I wonder about is rook h5, but I think, let's see, what would happen? Rook h5. It's some probably obvious continuation to me. Not to me. Probably some obvious continuation I'm not noticing. Excuse me. Let's see, rook h5. The idea behind rook h5 is that you get to play bishop takes h2 and bishop g3, forcing a perpetual check. I'm just wondering why this rook h5 move doesn't work at the moment. The idea is that rook h5, d takes c5, pawn captures knight, is threatening bishop takes h2 check, king h1, bishop g3, and this is annoying for white to play. So I'm just curious about what's the idea behind this kind of continuation. Let's see what's happening in this position. see, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, d4, and if I play rook h5, h3 can be played. Oh, what a beautiful continuation. I'm not seeing that the knight can actually move away. That's very nice. The knight can't actually move away from this square because, in fact, the rook is hanging in this position. That's a very, very hard to see continuation, in my opinion. That that I didn't notice that this queen is still maintaining this connection on the h5 square. So white wins actually. That makes a lot of sense. I didn't really look at it beyond that. So it really makes sense why that works for white. All right, guys, let's see the next problem. Well, we can immediately see that the white king is very, very weak. It's not in great shape, and I wonder about how to approach this position. Very, very interesting. Well, this rook on b2 is very interestingly placed. I wonder what the purpose of it is. There's a lot of interesting positional things in this position. Excuse me. I'm just not sure about how to approach this. This is not looking obvious to me about how to get at the white king. There's a lot of checks like queen f3 that are just being taken away by the queen on the c3 square. I'm looking at rook takes e1, queen takes e1, queen takes d4. Notice that these are all checks and captures that we're looking at, or rook takes e1, queen takes e1, queen f3 is also possible. But what I want to focus on is the escape routes. I want to prevent all escape routes here in this position for white. One kind of it doesn't work either. It's very difficult to find anything actually. It's surprisingly difficult for black. I mean, to find a reasonable continuation here. I see another idea with rook takes c2. I just wonder what's the follow-up to that. It does not look obvious. Rook takes c2, rook takes e8. I don't see a checkmate. Although maybe you could take the queen. That's true. Okay, so rook takes c2, and I think this is actually breaking through the white king. The idea with rook takes c2 is that I'm threatening rook takes, I think, threatening rook takes e1, I think, right? Or I'm just threatening the queen. Sometimes, guys, I'm really slow right now. I thought a rook takes c2. I completely forget about this, but you have a primary threat here on the queen here that must be addressed by white. So if rook takes c2 happens, rook takes e8, then we're taking the queen, obviously. And that queen is the most important piece in the game, so you want to keep that on the board if you're white. So after rook takes c2, it turns out I don't think that there is a proper defense for white to maintain the queen to protect this diagonal here. I think after rook takes c2, maybe queen b4 is the right move. And I'm just looking at what is the best way of trying to approach this position for black. It's not so obvious what's the best move. Rook takes c2, queen b4. Queen a5 is also possible, but I think that not obvious at all. Maybe I play. Not obvious at all, actually. What's the best way of approaching this position? Say rook takes c2, queen b4. And maybe rook e to e2. That looks really, really suspicious to me that this might actually work, but I'm not so convinced that this works, to be honest. One idea that you can also consider is, guys, I feel embarrassed to say that I didn't notice a mate in 2 here. See, sometimes I can be a really silly guy. When rook takes e1 followed by queen takes c2 is kind of embarrassing not to see. Well, guys, I was looking at a lot of stuff here, and it's unbelievable that I didn't see that for a while. But yeah, the idea is just, I had the right idea with removing the defender of the c2 square with rook takes c2, but I had it in the wrong order, and after rook takes e1, it's just an immediate win. Took me a while to see that. Oh my god. Very, very embarrassing stuff. Ugh, maybe next time it will be better. Interesting. Queen and the rooks are just spectacularly placed, and I already see the idea that white is supposed to do. Notice that this pawn has created a defender of the g7 square. Black really had to address this threat in this position. But what black missed, or couldn't have prevented, I guess, is the idea that, okay, if I get something on the h7 square, like a rook on h7 or my queen on h7, notice that these are just well-positioned pieces here. They're focusing along this rank, every one of them. The f7, g7, and h7 squares are critical in this position. So one thing we definitely have to look at is ideas of how to get to the h7 square, where it would be checkmate. The rook on g8, the pawn on g7 are preventing black's king from escaping. Notice that there's no other edge to this board, so black is almost mated in this position. What we have to notice is that, if I could move this pawn away, I could get that desired rook h7 and queen h7 checkmate. But how do we force that? How can we force our way through to smash our way through black's king? And the idea is that we are going to sacrifice the queen, surprisingly. We're going to play queen takes h6, and it's not normal to give up your queen, but the thing is, it's not, the queen is the most important piece, but like I mentioned earlier, sometimes other pieces are more important than the queen, and the queen can be used as a sacrificial tool to break through the black king and get to the h7 square like we desired with our rook on h7. The g8 square is taken by the rook over here, so black is checkmated here. That was a very nice one to find in a game, by the way. You don't come across queen sacrifices often. Interesting. So yeah, in this position, white is going to be pushing the a pawn. If he could have like 6 moves, white wins easily. Maybe 3 or 4 moves actually. White wins easily. But it's black's move, and black can take advantage of this, I think, with some certain ideas here. One idea is that, okay, this king is very, very weak. I want to bring my rook somehow into the game. It's taking away the h1, the h2, and the h3 squares. So the black king is somewhat restricted here. The king can't go to g3, can't go to f3, can't go to those 3 squares like I just mentioned, and it can't go to f2 either, and it can only go to the g1 and the f1 squares. I wonder, if I force it back with, let's say, the check, as our thoughts might immediately recommend to me, let's say f3 check, I don't think he can go king g1, probably because of probably queen a2, right? Followed by queen a1 checkmate. I don't see a way to prevent the checkmating threats over here. Very, very tricky stuff. Interesting. Queen a2. Let's go through that. f3 check. King g1, followed by queen a2 is pretty much threatening the back row here, and there's no way for the queen to assist in the defense of these 2 squares over here. White doesn't really have a check either to help assist in the defense, I think. So let's run through that. f3, king g1, queen a2. I think that wins for black. But let's see, f3, king f1 is just rook h1, so I guess that's just mate, right? Very, very nice continuation. f3, king g1 is the key move, and what we have to see here is the very quiet and delicate move that's winning what I'm noticing now is that also queen g here is also very good for me. Very, very surprising actually that this is not also a good move for me. Queen g8 and queen a2. I wonder what's wrong with queen, um, with that. I think queen a2 is better. I just looked at a line with queen g here, and I think the idea is that white can play knight g3. I move the king. This check is blockaded. The difference is that queen a2 is actually, I think that's still mate with knight g3. Knight g3, queen g8. If I move the king somewhere, I'm still playing rook h1 followed by queen h check, queen h3, queen g2 checkmate. Interesting that both of them are very plausible. I'm just wondering what's the difference between them. See, queen g8 threatens mate immediately. Knight g3, rook h1. That does look like mate. I don't even have to play anything after that, do I? So queen g8 is forced. Oh my god, interesting. I just failed that. I feel embarrassed now. What was the right continuation? Queen a2, but what's wrong with queen here on the g8 square? I'm threatening rook h1 checkmate followed by, queen h3, queen h7, queen h3, followed by that one. I'm not really sure what's wrong with that. Let's see what the analysis board says, guys. f3, king g1, queen a2 is also possible. I wonder what's wrong with queen g8. There must be an obvious reason why this is not working. Interesting. Why is this not working? Queen g7, it says that white is quite okay, probably, right? Except it's not even giving that as a decent move. Am I hanging something somehow? That's very surprising. Queen g8. There's nothing on the queen right here that would indicate that to me. I'm baffled here, actually. What could the problem be? Let's see, queen g8. I'm gonna pause this recording actually just for myself to figure this out. You know, guys, I'm sometimes really strange when I calculate. I was thinking after queen g8, knight g3, rook h1, king takes h1 was not possible, but of course king h1 is not possible, but knight takes g3 is possible. And what I didn't see is that once you, let's say, move the king over here, the knight can retreat back here, and you covered all the proper squares. And wow, that's quite embarrassing that I didn't see that one. I think also after knight takes h1, queen here, knight g3, king, queen to the h file, right? This is the normal continuation. I think white is actually escaping with king f1, and now this king can run to the d2 square, and I think it's just really escaping, honestly. I don't see how black's catching it. White's pawn is promoting and white wins, I think. So I feel quite embarrassed I didn't see that, actually. Knight g3, I missed something in my calculation often. It's very, I don't know, maybe I'm just bad at tactics, but that seemed like just the ideas are important in this position to see. Just calculating it all through. Next problem. I think I'll be cutting it off soon, by the way, guys. Well, this problem is looking a lot brighter, though. So what we have to notice is that, the knight is here on the e2 square. The king is in the crossfire of the rook right over here. Any move by the pawn might be a threat against the king. For example, we have to look at the captures on the e3 square, which is a check along this file right here. So I think that would be our first move that we really have to look at, this check with the powerful rook here on the f7 square. After pawn takes e3, I don't really see a move, other than queen f3 and knight f4. These are the only legal moves, actually. F takes e3, f takes e3, queen f3, rook f3 is just checkmate, and f3, knight f4, rook f4, king here, it's just mate somehow. Queen check here on the f2 square, king d3, queen takes d2 is just checkmate. So that looks like a good continuation and solid one for black. And the idea is that rook here is not winning the game. You know, that's even worse that I didn't even see the simple mate in one. Okay, well, ideas are still the same, but I went about it in too elaborate of a way. I'm not even looking at, you know, mate in ones sometimes. Quite embarrassing, but after knight f4, I think we can see that the idea was that rook takes f4, king e2, queen f2 is still a checkmate with the king running to the d1 or d3, but still queen d2 is still a checkmate that we have to notice. All right, let's do another one. Actually, I'm pretty interested here. Notice in a lot of these problems we have to prevent the king's escape route. Notice that the queen is always like on this square that it would be checking the knight. I think this is a great reason why the knight is so well working with the queen. The queen just takes away every one of the squares that the knight doesn't, and the knight takes away all the squares that the queen doesn't. So I think that's one reason why the queen and knight are just such a great combination if you're interested in chess theory. Let's see. In this position, black's king is very vulnerable, I would say. The queen here is potentially dangerous on f6, but there's knight takes d4 at some point, perhaps threatened with this queen along this file. But I don't think that's a big threat. I also want to note that perhaps that we can let's say, we have to look at all forcing moves. g7 pawn push is also plausible in this kind of position. Queen f7 is possible, but that would lead to a queen trade. But now I've noticed that bishop b5 is also another idea. Note that g7, queen takes g7, or bishop takes g7 is just not good for black, I think. Not good for white, excuse me. g7, bishop takes g7, bishop b5, check. Not doing much for white, as bishop d7, queen takes e6. Notice that there's this crossfire pin here. King d8 is not attacking anything, and I think white actually is doing quite okay, maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe g7, queen takes g7 is the right move, because you still have the bishop b5, queen, bishop d7, and the queen can come back to the e7 square to defend the whole position. I think that's why. I know that's very difficult to calculate in your head if you're not familiar with this kind of position or pattern. But the idea is that bishop b5 check here first is the right continuation, followed by bishop d7. And now we see this crossfire idea. The bishop is pinning this bishop along this king. So now we can go to the e6 square, which is not defended by this bishop, because this bishop has to address the king before it addresses anything else. Also, actually, queen takes e6 is also not the best move. Queen to f7 is the right continuation. I was just thinking queen takes here is the right continuation, but it turns out queen f7 check, forcing the king to go to the d8 square is the right continuation. Queen takes e6, bishop e7 is not giving me much, I think. Maybe g7 is doing something with the promotion idea, but queen f7 is looking very, very normal. As the king is forced to go to the d8 square, the bishop here is left unprotected, and this is actually leading to a forced checkmate here with the queen reaching the e8 square. The queen also on the c7 is taking the way to escape route. We have to think about this in step-by-step reasoning. Some tactics you just don't see the whole way through. When I look at tactics, I don't really calculate it the whole way through, unless it's like, let's say, like really, really important. It's important to recognize what's really important in a tactical combination. Once you see the idea with bishop b5 and then the light square is being really weak, bishop d7 I noticed was blocking this rank right over here from the queen's defense here and the assistance in the defense. My queen is potentially a lot more dangerous, and after bishop b5, also the e6 square is really weak as well. It's one thing that you want to keep in note, I think. So it's just recognition of weak squares, and what's most important is what's important when it comes to tactics. Taking free pieces, noticing the patterns in which you can win free pieces, I think it's important. So that's a very nice problem, I think. Right. Okay. Well, in this next problem, it's That's an interesting problem. I'm interested. What's the idea? I want somehow to get the rook on h8. If I can move this rook to h8 somehow, it won't be mate, but I see this checkmating pattern here with like the bishop covering the g8 and f7 squares, the rook moves somehow, and the queen is covering the g7 and h8 squares. So I just need to check this black king somehow. I want also rook g7 in this position. That would be very nice in this position to have, but I just can't get it. That's disappointing. Um, let's see. What to calculate first? Okay, we can capture rook takes e8, but after rook takes e8, I don't see an immediate checkmate. We also have to keep in mind that queen f1 check might be a dangerous kind of idea that we want to allow shrug for. Our rook can't leave the back rank because the black queen actually checks us. That's not nice. Rook e7 is also plausible, and the idea is that after rook takes e7, the rook cannot cover with rook f7 because I actually have the bishop covering the f7 square. I think that's the right way of approaching things. So I think this is actually going to lead to a forced win since rook e7 is attacking the black king. Notice that these weak squares along the h8, g7, g8, f7 squares were just taken by the white queen, and black's pawns are not assisting in the defense of helping the king move up the board to avoid checkmate. So rook takes e7 is actually just forced. Rook f7 is forced, and now we can just focus on not playing bishop takes f7. That would lose the game immediately to queen f1. It's important to not fall for that. That's even though you might want to play bishop f7 and then move the bishop back to gain a check, just give the check immediately sometimes is the best way of approaching things. And now the black queen has to take. We take the queen, and now you're up a queen. Very easy win for white, excuse me. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I somewhat failed on some of these problems. That's okay. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing, but I think I learned quite a bit. Some flaws in my own tactical kind of thinking. I learned quite a bit. I hope you guys did too. If you're wondering about how to approach tactics and how to improve on your tactical vision and what are some good ways of approaching, what are your thought processes to help you improve as a player? Maybe this helped. I hope. Thanks for watching, guys. Really appreciate that you doing that. See you around.